The Vision 2030 identifies science, technology and innovation as a key component of economic development. And that's why the government in 2013 formed the Kenya National Innovation Agency, Kenya, to drive and deepen innovation in the country. This week on Inside Government, we are talking to Kenya Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Tony Omwanze. And what we want to find out is where are we in driving the growth of innovation in the country. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. for finding time to be with us here. I mean, you have just concluded the much talked about Kenya Innovation Week. What would you say was the low-hanging fruit?
Thank you very much. Out of the Kenya Innovation Week, which now is a national flagship initiative that culminates all the work of a year in the context of innovation, that was also recognized and graced by the head of state as he climaxed the whole week at the Jamhuri Day. He did actually visit our forums 3 times in that week, starting with the 6th of December. Some of the low-hanging fruits that stood out is that the head of state actually pronounced himself about the acceleration and fast-tracking of the startup bill, which will create the atmosphere for supporting innovators and startups. He also spoke about the startup fund, which is going to be the platform that provides funding specifically for very progressive and promising innovations and startups. So of course, he did talk about the Hustler Fund as well, which is really looking at SMEs and small enterprises. And then of course, the head of state did pronounce that the National Innovation Week will be a continuous annual forum, which will help us to aggregate all our national initiatives in the context of innovation. So I think it's a very timely thing, and more so because this is the first national forum that the head of state held. It's very promising for us. We hosted the Secretary General of Commonwealth Secretariat, Madam Patricia Scotland. She came in all the way from the UK specifically to be part of this process and made a lot of pronouncements about the support that the Commonwealth is going to be providing.
You know, there was so much hopes and a sigh of relief when finally the ST&I Act came into force in 2013, that finally the issues around innovation, technology, you know, were going to be thrust into the forefront of our planning. Has this happened really?
I would say yes, in a way. Of course, there's a lot of ground to cover in terms of the expectation, because you see, when you set it up, there is this feeling in people that now it's a silver bullet. It's going to fix everything. But we also realize that, you know, setting up institutions and operationalizing them, and given how transitions also happen, things change and priorities shift a little bit. When the STI Act was established, the operationalization was when we had the Ministry of University Education, Science and Technology. Yeah. But somewhere along the way they were merged again with the one that deals with basic education, so it became the Ministry of Education. And what that means is that also the attention that you receive as an STI sector isn't equivalent to the previous context. And so there was a little bit of a slow momentum, though the institutions continue to function. But I think now what has happened again is that the new leadership has basically positioned science, technology and innovation at the core of the leadership. And the attention is really coming through, the political goodwill, the funding, the visibility. I mean, just imagine shaping the national forum called Jamhuri and give it a theme of tech and innovation. How better could it be? I mean, it's never happened in this country. It's the 56th time that then it takes that shape, which is a clear indication the leadership is going to drive it quite aggressively.
Let's also talk about the issues of funding. And when you look at Kenya's expenditure when it comes to R&D, research and development, and you're talking about less than 1% of our national GDP, which is quite significantly low. Do you see any attempt or any efforts to try and increase our expenditure on R&D?
The answer is absolutely yes. First of all, I think sometimes the way we measure and we quantify this allocation of R&D could be a bit skewed depending on what are you looking at. You see, private sector does put in a lot of resources towards R&D. There are a number of development partners, NGOs, and research centers that actually put in funds into R&D. We have government agencies that have arms of research in their institutions, and they actually allocate budget. But somehow the tracking of it doesn't seem to be well aggregated, so that then you can actually quantify the percentage. But we could say, yeah, it's somewhere around 1% plus minus, depending on what you really brought in. But I think what is more encouraging is the step forward. Now, in Africa, there are about 3 or so countries that have put together a startup bill and translated to an innovation fund. All right? And I think we're getting right there at this time. We'll probably be the 4th country or so in Africa. And there has been a lot of funding also coming from diaspora, as well as foreign direct investment, specifically into startups and supporting the R&D narrative. But definitely the fact that the government is mainstreaming innovation I'm so clear in my mind that it's going to translate this and change the narrative significantly in the context of government allocation of resources towards R&D.
I know one of your core mandate is to ensure that the innovation ecosystem is harnessed. And so how do you regulate the innovation ecosystem without stifling innovation and growth at the same time?
That keeps me awake at night. What I think is a better term I like to use is coordination. Because ideas come anytime, anywhere, in any sector, by anyone. And what you need is to channel the energy and the ideas and the creativity into an environment that then they can be developed. And what we think in most cases, it will be through incubation hubs, into innovation hubs, into tech spaces and so forth. So if I were to ask a random person, hey, if you have an idea, where would you go? Some of them won't tell you they know. So what we need is to provide that information. So that means we must understand where are incubation hubs, what are their areas of focus, what are their capacities and so forth. So as people bring in ideas, we say, oh, you belong in a specific incubation hub, that's where you'll work best and you'll be supported. And then our job is also to ensure that these incubation hubs function optimally. You see, when we say a national innovation system, what that means, all sectors are brought in, government, private sector, academia and so forth, civil society, media, all these are contributing in some way. Then when you say it's a system, it means there are components that make up the system. Now these components must work optimally. So it's our responsibility to come and make sure that the education system is working optimally to create innovators, all right? It is my responsibility to contribute to the Kenya Copyright Board, for example, to ensure that, hey, people know where you are so that they can protect their ideas. KIPI, for example. Mine is to make sure that the pipe end-to-end is functional and the interrelationships between the various components is as optimal as it can be. So let's take an example. There are angel investors and VCs. I have a duty to make sure that that community is growing and that community has access to innovation hubs, has access to information about emerging startups. It is my job to help the discoverability of new ideas to be linked to potential funders. It is my responsibility to make sure we are putting up an appropriate policy and regulatory environment so that then people work and operate in a fair ground. So really we think through all these components. Now, for example, the startup fund. It is in my interest to make sure that the startup fund is going to function in the most optimal way. That means we can identify very promising innovations, channel resources through incubation hubs, and make sure the right persons receive the support they need and they move up the value chain. So yes, I tend to see the term more coordination as opposed to regulation, because of the tone that sometimes people feel like, oh, you're going to stifle us. But I think we enable. I think regulation doesn't necessarily mean it's going to block. It does enable, and that's what we're going to be doing as a National Innovation Agency.
And again, it's also a question of striking a balance between regulation and over-regulation, because, studies are there to prove that over-regulations of an industry, tend up to do the opposite. Let's talk about, the Matt talked about the startup fund. what kind of a fund are we talking about? Because in this country we have so many funds. We have the Hustlers Fund, we have the Youth Fund, you have the Women Fund, you have the Equalization Fund. What kind of a fund are we talking about, and who qualifies, to tap into that fund?
So let's start with the first time that the head of state went public about the startup fund. That happened at the Sarit Center, where we had the Innovation Week, and he was the chief guest on the 6th of December. He walked around and looked at a number of innovators who were exhibiting. There were large corporates as well as young, small enterprises. As he walked through the startup village, we call it a startup village, he saw very young ideas that look extremely promising, and he could tell that this is potentially very scalable. And then he said, I have remembered, we were supposed to work on this startup fund and startup bill, all right? So in other words, the moment arose, and then, sooner, louder and louder, it became clear that it is definitely something he has been thinking about, and he wants to make it happen as soon as possible. So in that context that I've given, first of all, we have a simple definition of a startup. There are many definitions that people have generated, academic analysis and so forth, but there are common attributes about those definitions. It is an enterprise that is seeking and searching for a scalable business model. That means within a very short time, it can actually employ thousands of people. So it is not an SME as such, it is a potentially scalable, and it tends to solve a problem that is sometimes not known, all right, and it affects very many people, and tends to use technology as a means of pushing the solution to the market. So the characteristics of a startup make it rather different from an SME because of its potential scalability. Now, what we want to do is that it is a high-risk venture, that we have to admit, but there is always a process in which innovations and startups are basically supported to move up the value chain. And he used even the word de-risking, because normally for scaling to happen, private sector has to get involved, and they've got to fund it. That's where VC come in, and venture capitalists and so forth, and angel investors. But for them to get involved, they need to feel that the risk has been sorted out. Someone took the trouble to sort out the problems at early stage. And the best placed person to do that is government. So there's what we call a maturity model for startups. So at the early stages, when government gets involved and reduces the risk around that startup, and once it starts really gaining traction and momentum, then private sector comes in and brings in not only funding, but also the expertise on how to deal with the market in a larger scale, all right? All the expertise you need, the marketing, the business modeling, the sharpening of your messaging and so forth. And then the private sector picks up, and then probably government pulls back. That's the model that has helped Israel. As a classic example, where they've got a fund that basically can give you up to 95% of any funds you need. It doesn't matter how much money. And that's the way we visualize a startup fund. And I would also say that there are certain elements of the startup fund that we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to incorporate, is that the way the incubation hubs are going to function, they need to be supported. And that's largely going to be through the startup fund. The way I see it is that the person who is going to support the incubation and nurturing of the startup must be facilitated appropriately. So for us, it is about incubation centers and acceleration centers and the startups. This one being supported and this one being supported. We ensure best practices here, standard operating procedures, good methodologies, world-class global standards are known, and then startups are supported. And in a little while, yes, others may collapse. We can't rule that out. But in the course of time, those that succeed significantly make up for what is lost. And I must also say that, loss of an idea in the course of the growth of a startup is not necessarily a bad idea, because we learn from loss as long as we were disciplined and we were running in an ideal way. And if we realize the market maybe is not ready for this startup, we pivot, we take a different direction. And that's normal, because we are creating jobs, we're empowering people, people are learning, people are getting facilitated, and we grow the economy.
Mm-hmm. And you see, when you look at the innovation ecosystem in Kenya, there are multiple players. You have KIPI, you have Nakosti, you have the Science Research Fund, you have institutions like Konza. So where do you fall in Northeast value chain as Kenya?
So let's take cons as we all contribute and play different roles as national institutions in the innovation ecosystem, or call it innovation pipeline. Konza is providing a platform. You know, there are going to be buildings, there's sophisticated facilities that you can go there and develop your idea. So it's a facility, it's an ecosystem in itself. It's going to have a university there, you know, there are institutions, low level, high level, there will be incubation centers and so forth. So it's a platform. If you look at Kiridi, for example, if I have an idea and I want to try and develop a small business out of it, Kiridi is the place to go and test and iterate, review this thing, and they can give you the expertise because they've got scientists in there who help you. And once your product starts to make sense, you move to an environment where you can grow it. And Kiridi wouldn't be the environment. Probably you go to Konza because now there's a broader ecosystem there to try and develop your business idea. If you look at Nakosti, for example, they are in the regulatory environment. They are trying to make sure that they advise government, they collect data about the trends, and they create national priorities in terms of research and innovation. So they kind of license research institutions. So they provide a regulatory kind of atmosphere. National Research Fund specifically set up to fund research, and though they do technology and innovation, but they are a funding institution. So they mobilize resources and fund. You look at KIPI, they are specifically set to protect registration of intellectual property. Kenya Copyright Board, and so on and so forth. Kenya Bureau of Standards is in the pipeline of innovation. So if I've reached at the very end and somebody needs to give standardization and guidelines, then KEBS come into equation. And KRA is also going to be there in the value chain, and they're going to be expecting, you know, that you contribute into the development of the ecosystem through resource, mobilization. So to answer the question, then, where is the Kenya National Innovation Agency? Yeah. Somebody got to coordinate this whole process. Because as a typical person probably who has left a university, and I used to be in university before, I would ask my students, how many of you know where KIPI is? Barely 5% raise up their hand. Somebody got to coordinate the effort and say, hey, you know, this is how the value chain looks like. We're growing here. We are not very strong here. We need to move up the value chain, engage private sector and say, hey, we need to bring resources. We need to strengthen our policy environment, engage government, make sure that the education system, all right, thinks through how innovation is and creativity are embedded. So classic example, you go to China and you get elementary school. Somebody will tell you about intellectual property. Young kids, all right? That means the education system thought through it. So the innovation agency, when we say develop and manage the national innovation system, is to make sure that all these components are functioning optimally and they are speaking to one another, so that as an innovator or a startup goes through the process, it's clear how they move. Because these agencies will concentrate in their own space and they may not worry about the linkages between the various agencies, and that's for the National Innovation Agency to do.
Let's also talk about the issues of funding, because I know it's always a big challenge, and I've gone through your strategic plan for 2018 to 2022, which is just elapsing. And one of the issues that you highlighted in your SWOT analysis was, of course, the issues of limited resources, because they are wholly exchequer funded. How do you plan to address this going forward?
Yeah, I would say that it is important to also understand that as a country and as a particular subsector, you're at a certain stage of development. And there are certain realities you have to deal with at a certain stage of development. So the agency has been in that formative stage, all right? And the resources available have been limited. We've gotten support from the National Research Fund, from private sector, and so on and so forth, to move on. But, you know, we've learned enough that now there are new trends that we have been able to trigger. So classic example is the Startup Fund, all right? And that is a government initiative now that will go directly to supporting promising innovations. Second, we've built a good momentum around private sector and development partners. In fact, a good number of programs that we run right now are by a number of partners. It's a good thing, and sometimes you may not necessarily as a very good thing, because it means you're over-relying, or rather you're relying on support from other partners to drive a core agenda. But you see, when you're in a phase of development, there are certain things that may not balance out very well. But as you pick up, then you get more and more support. So as we see right now with the head of state making a pronouncement about the startup fund, I've also had discussions with the minister around strengthening the funding for the innovation agency. I have absolute confidence that as we get into the new financial year, funding is basically going to pick up. I also must mention that the support to universities and research centers and TVETs, it is something that turns out in the manifesto, the Kenya Kwanza manifesto, about incubation mechanisms, technology transfer mechanisms, and it's now been put in the subsector planning as we move into Vision 2030 MTP4, and therefore I'm seeing all the signs that are favorable. Part of it also is, do people understand about some of these issues? So sometimes some things can take a bit of time before people get a very good grip of it, and then once it picks, you basically are unstoppable, partly because even also the international community gets involved. Investors start getting involved, international investors, and we've seen that trend over the last couple of years.
And now you're based here in Nairobi, yes. And of course our innovation is not just confined to Nairobi County. I mean, you go to Mandera, you go to Lamu, they are innovators. Yeah. How do you ensure that you tap into the innovators in Mandera without necessarily having them come to Nairobi, Lamu, Kakamega, and the other counties?
Great question indeed. The first thing that is interesting is that different regions are blessed with certain unique characteristics, and we recognize. So I like to give an example of Taita Taveta. That's where you get minerals. If you went to Kisumu, you will deal with the lake issues. If you go to the coast, there are certain things you will find. So we are cognizant of the fact that there are certain unique elements in different regions. And the way the innovation agency was set up is that we look to build incubation centers across the country. And then we do the coordination. And so far, the private sector has kind of championed a number of incubation centers. County governments have also set up incubation centers, like Makueni have an amazing incubation center. There are a number of development partners who have also been involved in setting up incubation centers. The Ministry of Youth, for example, has been running youth centers, and we are looking to convert them. There are more than 160 of them. Convert them into innovation centers, and they're spread across the entire country, and all we concentrate is the coordination. In the course of time, we may have regional offices as a national innovation agency, but that's something we will establish based on what the needs are on ground. And on that note, if we have the good operating procedures in the hubs, then we have a national presence. And technology now enables us to track things remotely, irrespective of where they are. The other thing that I think I want to mention is that now we have associations. For example, we've got an association of startup enablers that call themselves ASEC. There is also an association for countrywide innovation hubs, and they have built relationships with all these hubs. So right now they are in hundreds of hubs. And through those associations, they are able to engage on the issues that they face challenges and how they need to address some of them, and they reach out to us and so forth. And one of the things that they've actually done, they've organized themselves into groups, and they're able to run regional innovation weeks. So currently, Mombasa, for example, you'll find there's an Pwani Innovation Week. You go to Rift Valley, and so forth, Lake Basin, and Mount Kenya, regionally. So now there are 10 of them that run annually, and that becomes a mechanism of aggregating, and then the Kenya Innovation Week becomes a climax. And that is a trend that we've seen over the last couple of years that gives us the confidence that we can support innovators as and where they are.
Let's also talk about, the management of Kenya, and also the occasional political realignment in our country. You are in the Ministry of Education, now you're in the Ministry of Sports and Youth Affairs. The next time, God knows, you're going to be where. And of course, with these realignments, comes with some level of disruption, some level of discomfort. How can you wean yourself against these, and how can this be addressed?
I think it's an interesting question, and I used to be anxious until I got to the experience and I realized that it was not a problem. Life went on almost the same way as it was. In fact, the mandate expanded and there's more excitement. Now, as it is right now, a number of administrative support still comes from the Ministry of Education in as much as we've moved. There's a lot of support that still is available, and the transition is also supported. So there isn't disruption. Honestly, I have not lost an employee. No one has left just because we moved. We're still using the same facility and we are being given a new, better facility. Funding is the same. The only thing that changed is that the PS changed. And maybe the office that we were going to report to on something or the cabinet secretary changed. In any case, even the Ministry of Education, the cabinet secretary changed. So the only thing is that the office that I was going to go to see the cabinet secretary is the one that has changed. And come to think of it, as we move to the new ministry with the new energy, new people, new leadership, there's a lot of excitement. So I haven't felt any negative effect because of that transition, and I wouldn't be surprised that even if anything were to happen and another reorganization happens, that we wouldn't feel it. But I think what is more important is to keep track of the growth of the institution and its contribution to the national innovation system. Can we say that this year we are doing greater things than we did last year? Yes. We have better programs. Are we growing? Are we impacting more people? Are we energizing more people? Are we creating transformation as we move from one year to another? That's amazing. Because part of when we do the Kenya Innovation Week on an annual basis, we do some kind of review. Where have we been? Where are we? And where we are. Some alignments, adjustments may happen, but we don't find them disruptive at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But of course, it's good to appreciate that. Somehow it can also be discomforting.
Yes, and especially people who had been working with you and are aligned to a certain ministry. For example, I do have colleagues that I worked with in the Ministry of Education. There are universities we're working with and research centers and TVETs. And then they go, oh, you have moved to a different ministry. Now, how will you continue with the work we're doing? How do we get all of you? Yeah. I think what people need is the reassurance. And part of forums like this and engaging and say, well, we are one government. Yeah. Even if you move to another ministry, the cabinet secretary, it is in his or her interest that you support institutions, because that's where the youth are anyway, a number of youths, for example. So the cabinet secretary has been extremely supportive and has given us, the confidence that we need, and we spend a lot of time to educate people that, yeah, it may feel uncertain, but we're still there. For example, we just held the commercialization and Entrepreneur Institution Leaders Summit when we have moved to the new ministry. And most of the people who attended were vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors, senior researchers, and so on and so forth. And we will continue to do that year in, year out.
You see, as we come to the end of this interview, I also want to find out from you, when you look at the Global Innovation Index, Kenya's ranking has been deteriorating, despite the fact that, so many organizations, have been set up and so much attention has been given to innovation, from issues of research to funding, to incubation. And for example, when you look at the 2017 GII index, Kenya was rated as position 80 in the world. Now we're talking about position 88. Why is this happening?
Very good question. Frankly speaking, I haven't gone into too much depth in terms of how data is collected and how it is aggregated and how accurate and reliable that is. Mm-hmm. I haven't spent time partly because the agency in the country that is given the responsibility currently to coordinate that data collection is KBC. And over time, there are changes that have happened in KBC that also affect the effectiveness of the institution. And we think a number of them are being addressed gradually. So I haven't spent a lot of time in that case to be able to authoritatively say, why is it that we're doing badly, yet there's a lot of investment. Now, I've looked at some of the indicators that they're measuring, and I keep feeling that we could be doing better than the way it is reported. That's my personal view. Now, the Kenya National Innovation Agency was also set up to be the custodian, all right, of the data about the national innovation system. And so what we are currently initiating a process is how do we get sure that Kenya is given the responsibility to provide the most accurate data. But at the same time, Kenya must have the capacity to mobilize this data. So we're also setting up the system to make sure we collect the most accurate data. During the Kenya Innovation Week, we launched the first Kenya Innovation Outlook. So one of the decisions I made as a CEO, I said, I want us to measure ourselves first of all. Let's don't worry too much about what someone else says. Let's measure ourselves first now. Let's organize our data. Let's get our staff in place to understand what they have to do. Then we will open up the conversation about, is this correct measure based on what we have collected? And I think we're going to change that narrative. We did promise the head of state that in the first 5 years, we're going to move from 80s to top 50.
Tony Omwansa, thank you very much indeed for finding time to be with us here on Inside Government and, of course, sharing with us your insight.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always exciting to engage on this issue because I'm very passionate about it.
Very well. We wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Well, innovation is the future, and of course, Kenya cannot afford to be left behind. Well, we have been talking to the CEO of the Kenya National Innovation Agency, Kenya, Dr. Tony Omwansa, on the current status of innovation in Kenya. My name is O'Brien Kimani. This has been Inside Government, and you're watching KBC Channel 1. Have yourself a good afternoon.